Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. Again, hello everyone, welcome. This is the final discussion of season 6 of the Fueling Collaboration. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your support. My name is Lindsay Hosier, and I am the coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, and it is my pleasure to be opening today's discussion. Before we do get started, we do have a quick poll to gather who is joining us today. And Eric, will you please launch our poll? And we do have 3 questions that we hope everyone will answer. Question 1 is what best describes your work? Question 2, where are you physically located? And question 3, how did you hear about today's webinar? And we'll keep it open for another 10 seconds or so. And thank you everyone for answering the poll. We really appreciate it. All right, Eric, we will go ahead and end the poll. And taking a quick look at the results, we have a lot of land and natural resource managers with us today, a handful of fire practitioners, researchers, a few students, and communications extension. A lot of people from the Northeast, Midwest, Southern States, Central Apps. Awesome. Thanks everyone for sharing and answering that poll. We really appreciate it. We do have some quick housekeeping to go through before we do kick off the discussion today. The Fueling Collaboration Panel Discussion Series is presented by the Joint Fire Science Program Fire Science Exchange Networks, all of whom you can see here on the screen. And the goals of Fueling Collaboration are to bring together researchers and managers to learn about and discuss the latest in fire science and to build collective learning and collaborative opportunities across the region. As mentioned earlier, this is our final discussion of season 6. Myself, the planning team, and all the panelists and moderators from this season want to thank each of you for joining our discussions. We do have immense gratitude for all of your support. And all of our discussions follow a similar format as what you are going to experience today. The discussion is built upon questions submitted in advance. Thank you to anyone who did submit any questions. All participants will be muted and video will be turned off during today's discussion. However, the chat box will remain open. We do encourage active participation in the chat box. We simply ask that chat messages stay on point with the discussion and be respectful and inclusive of differing opinions. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording on the Fueling Collaboration website as well as the Fueling Collaboration YouTube channel. Closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. You can access this where it says CC. If you click on that, that will engage the live captioning. And lastly, this discussion is approved for 1.5 Category 1 CFEs by the Society of American Foresters. We will be using the participant list to submit to SAF. Please check that your name is spelled correctly on your screen. If it is not, click the 3 dots next to your name and select Rename. In order to receive these credits, you must participate for the entire duration of the discussion and complete the online attendance form spreadsheet. And this will be shared in the chat box towards the end of the discussion. Within 2 weeks of this discussion, you will be emailed the certificate of attendance from Polly from the Ford Stewards Guild. If you do have any questions, we'll be dropping Polly's email into the chat box. Today's discussion will be exploring the complex relationship between fire and old-growth forest in the eastern United States and what role fire, either past, present, and future, plays in shaping these ecosystems. Our panelists include Dr. Ryan DeSantis, and he is an assistant professor of forest ecology and management at Oklahoma State University. Jimmy Dotson, Biologist Program Manager for NC State Parks. Dr. Lauren Pyle Knapp, Research Ecologist and Project Leader with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station. And Dr. William Flatley, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Central Arkansas and an adjunct professor in the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University. And our moderator today is Joe Marcel. He is the Senior Research Associate at the Center for Tree Ring Science at the University of Missouri, and he also serves as a coordinator for the Oak Woodlands Forest Fire Consortium. And before I pass it over to Joe to begin today's discussion, I would like to acknowledge all of our organizers and planning team, all of who you can see on the screen. They have been an absolute incredible team, and it's been nothing shy of delightful to work with all of these individuals to plan this season and past seasons. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any one of these individuals here on the screen. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Joe.
All right. Thank you, Lindsay, so much for introducing me and for introducing this session. I would like to say thank you to my Fueling Collaboration planning team colleagues, especially Lindsay Hosier and Eric Evanson. You all have really done a ton of important work to make this happen. So thank you so much. I'm honored to moderate a session on such an interesting and important topic. And I'm even more honored to have such great regional experts here on the panel and that they were willing to join us and share their time. And so to the panelists here, thank you so much. And I'm equally excited about all the interest exhibited by the high attendance and participation in terms of the registration questions. So to all of the attendees out there, thank you as well. And please engage here. There's within the audience, I do see lots of friends and colleagues, folks I haven't met yet, but I recognize that there's a lot of expertise in the audience. And so I encourage you to please share your expertise in the chat as this session moves along. So today's discussion should resemble an easygoing conversation, perhaps like you'd have at a conference or workshop where you opportunistically run into folks with similar interests and expertise, but maybe you don't often get opportunities to chat. So to the panelists, I say, jump right in today. Please don't hesitate. If you're thinking it, please go ahead and say it. But at the same time, if we do offer questions that for different reasons, maybe you're not comfortable answering, no problem. No problem at that at all. So I'd like to highlight that the panelists have provided a lot of relevant materials to this talk and that those are available on the Fueling Collaboration website and the web page that's specific to this session. There's a handful of peer-reviewed publications, GTRs, and extension fact sheets that are all gathered into this same location and easy for everyone to access. And so I do encourage you to check those out. Those resources are going to be discussed quite a bit today. So I'd like to introduce what I think is the objective of this session before we get very far. And the objective is to make science information related to fire management and ecology of eastern old growth ecosystems more available and easier to be applied by folks making those management decisions. I'd like to also briefly introduce the format of today's session. We had 118 questions submitted during the registration process. And I considered all of those questions closely, and I categorized those into 4 kind of natural topics along which I thought they broke. And the questions today, I've selected actual questions from people who submitted those. They're unaltered, and they all relate to these 4 major topics. So these include definitions of old growth And can that include fire dependent or fire adapted species and concepts? The historical fire ecology of old growth ecosystems, managing modern ecosystems towards having old growth characteristics. And then lastly, the idea of reintroducing fire to long unburned locations which contain old, very old trees and old growth characteristics. And then also there's the famous other category, because not everything fit into those four clean ones. And there's some interesting questions in those other categories. And so we're going to we're going to use all of those. Let's see. Um, and so I guess with that, I do want to just start with a quick story that expresses a little bit of my interest here and my history. Right after my undergrad, I moved out to Southern Oregon and I lived there for about 6 years. I worked in the woods that whole time. And early on in that experience, I was on an AmeriCorps crew. And we were enjoying a presentation by a forest ecologist on a national forest there where I was working. And to set the stage, this is the mid to late 90s. A couple of you out there in the audience might remember those days. And where I was in Southern Oregon, we were on the very tail of the timber wars associated with the spotted owl. And during that time, the Northwest Forest Plan was developed. And so the Northwest Forest Plan was developed just a couple years before I got there. So I'm listening to this forest ecologist give this talk about the Northwest Forest Plan and relating it to our work in the woods that we were doing. And this forest ecologist was this awesome person. He was on a national forest that was heavily impacted. He was really wise, but also jolly. It was kind of like a mixture of Yoda and Santa Claus. Like you just listened when this person talked. Everybody listened to him. He was really wise. And he was talking about exactly what we're talking about today, definitions of old growth and how that intersected the Northwest Forest Plan. And this person was heavily involved in that process. And he brought up these alternative definitions that were considered but didn't make it to the Northwest Forest Plan. Now, the definition that did make it into the Northwest Forest Plan for old growth, I'd say it was impactful nationwide. Wasn't just a Northwest Forest Plan, but that definition permeated, society and professional cultures across the country. It's stuck with us. So that definition really emphasized having forests with complex, multi-layered canopies. It emphasized having high density of large trees. And it also emphasized significant amounts of dead wood. So those were baked in to the definition, and each one of those is received quite a bit of criticism since then. Maybe we can discuss that today. But here's my point, is that during this definition, this person who everybody loved and respected, he said, under some of these alternative definitions, you might consider the scrub oak chaparral ecosystems of Table Rock, which is right where we were near Medford, Oregon, and the Oregon white oak savannas mixed in there. He laughed and he said, under some definitions, those would be considered old growth, or could be. And everybody in the room, dutifully laughed, myself included. Real smart folks there. Everybody laughed. And it was a funny thing to think that you could think of an old growth ecosystem as being anything other than these cathedral type forests that, the Northwest Forest Plan depicted. So whenever I hear about these systems, I think back to that moment or this topic. And I think of, what 180 degrees our professional societies as individuals we've done. If I heard someone say that comment today, it'd be viewed in a much different light. I'd say, heck yeah, those could be, and those should be considered within the old growth context. It's not an absurd idea. So I think it's just telling that even just in our short careers here, how much of a change has occurred within this concept of the potential for disturbance-mediated old growth ecosystems, for the idea that these could be something different. So with that, I'm going to now go into asking our panelists questions. And so I'm going to ask each panelist to provide a brief introduction to your background related to this topic, and to do so while answering this question. What is a commonly held misconception about old growth within the ecosystems that you work that might be considered a pet peeve of some sort, or maybe that just really gets to you? I'll share mine later if I have a chance. But with that, I first move to Dr. Lauren Pyle-Knapp. She's research ecologist and project leader with the Forest Service Northern Research Station, and she's located 2 floors above me right now in the same building. So please go for it.
Which is in Columbia, Missouri, right, Joe?
Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on the panel. So let's see. I am an East Coast girl, so sometimes I feel like I have a lens of like the Joyce Kilmer of old growth type of reference from just growing up. I did my graduate work at Clemson University, so I'm sort of southeastern in my education. Then I went out to California for 2 years and worked on the Sierra National Forest as an ecologist. So definitely thinking about those cathedral forests and old growth as it's shaped there. And then came to Missouri in 2018, where my perspectives definitely had to shift in what old growth looks like. Because here you have rocks and a few trees, and those can be really old. And that site can also be considered old growth. And then also thinking about our sort of concepts of old growth or remnant prairies and how those systems can be formed through long-term processes and functions. So yeah, even thinking about just grassland savannas to our woodlands and closed forests, I think is a really, really fun way to think about these systems. I guess concept or pet peeve, there's probably a few of them that I have. One, I guess, would be how our sort of contemporary measurements of these systems, and particularly in the East, they're very small, sort of relic patches that have somewhat, lost their sort of historical processes, particularly fire in some of them. And so our contemporary measurements of their structure and composition really don't reflect what may have helped get them there, or how they should be continually shaped to maintain their sort of structure and function and resilience into the future. So that's kind of my pet peeve, one of them. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, let's talk more about those. Jimmy Dotson, I'd like to move to you, and I'd like to say real quick that, during this process of organizing this session, it's been really great to get to know you all a little bit better. And Jimmy, in your bio, I just loved this part that you're an AFE certified fire ecologist, Wildlife Society certified biologist, and a North Carolina registered forester. So I just wanted to brag on you for a second for that, and to point out that you bring a wealth of diverse experience and perspective to this. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I'm based out of Central North Carolina. I work for the state park system. I've been with the state park system a little over a decade, and we have natural resource staff that cover all the natural community ecosystem types that run from the mountains to the coast. We are also in that sweet spot between the far southern states and the mid-Atlantic, New England kind of stretch. So we kind of see the best and greatest challenges from both ends of the spectrum based on where we sit geographically. Very similar to what Lauren was getting at, we have pockets that still retain old growth characteristics by traditional definition. We do have those pockets now in different places that fit those alternative definitions that you were bringing up, Joe. Most of our staff recognize those pieces and parts. From a fire standpoint, realistically, perspective-wise, if you roll the clock back about 15 to 20 years ago, our state park system was burning on average 500 to 700 acres a year statewide. So it wasn't that much, considering our park system at the time was about 190,000 acres. This tiny little fire footprint on a relatively small land area in the grand scheme of things. But by adding capacity and growing the concept of these being fire suppressed systems and fire dependent systems, we're now on average producing 10 to 15,000 acres of prescribed burning a year. So most of our work comes from prescribed burning. We do assist with wildfire response, and we do have wildfires. But I guess with my background, my ultimate pet peeve is how focused we are in the definition of old growth on the trees themselves and not just the other characteristics. Because everybody wants to talk about the really old trees, and forestry background, I like old trees. But it's not just the old trees. It's the ground cover, it's the structure, it's the species composition itself, as well as soil characteristics and things along those lines.
Thanks, Jimmy. We're going to talk about that a bunch. That's great. So next I'll ask Dr. William Flatley, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Central Arkansas and Adjunct Professor at School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University. Just aside on Will, I've been part of projects that have cited your papers so much about the fire history in the Appalachians. It's just incredible work, and I think it's been foundational for a lot of work that's occurred since then. And so it's just so awesome to have you on the panel. So same question goes to you, and please provide a brief introduction.
Thanks, Joe. And I am really happy to be invited to participate in this panel and talk about old growth and fire. And I'll have to give the compliments back to you as well that you and Mike Stambaugh and Richard Guyet's work are cited all the time in my work, and you all were kind of foundational in doing fire history work. And so I think a pet peeve, and I don't know if it's really a peeve for me, but as a dendrochronologist on this panel, I feel like I have to represent dendrochronologists in saying that we always love to point out to people that the biggest trees are often not the oldest trees, and that you get the oldest trees a lot of times on poor sites that may not have a lot of tree density, may not have really large individuals, but sort of slow and steady wins the race, and you get really old individuals in those situations. So that's one thing. And then I also wanted to mention, which I think we'll get into in a lot more detail, and has already been mentioned by both Jimmy and Lauren, that the perception of old growth versus, well, the idea of kind of widening out what old growth can be, and recognizing sometimes referred to as cryptic old growth that is not always apparent. And just two examples of that, and I find that I run into it a lot, looking for older forests and old wood and fire scars and looking at stand dynamics. But one is my dissertation work in Smoky Mountains National Park, and off of Cades Cove. I worked in a stand there that had never been logged. And I remember first visiting the site and with my advisor, Charles LaFawn, and we were walking through it, and we knew that this area had not been cut, but we just weren't that impressive. We were sort of expecting, even as forest ecologists and with some experience, these cathedral forests, particularly in the Smokies. We were imagining Joyce Kilmer. I think we had hiked there probably a couple days previously. And it was, there were some large trees, but the oaks, and there were some scattered large oaks, but there was a ton of really small hardwoods, in fire intolerant hardwoods that had come in since fire suppression, 70, 80 years previous. The stand had also been hit by pine beetle in the 2000s. And so, a decent amount of the pine had been lost on the ridges. Um, American chestnut had been lost in the 30s, right? And that had regenerated large patches, I think, probably in that stand. And so that was kind of like a recalibration. But then I've continued to see that. And so, just an example, I live here in Little Rock, and, like a mile north of me, on the edge of the city of Little Rock, there's this place, River Mountain. It has a big power line cut running through it, and there's mountain biking trails. And I'd even hiked it once or twice before realizing that there are really old trees, and I've cored them, that are over 150 years. And a bunch of, again, younger stuff that's grown up since then. There are fire scarred stumps. And so essentially, that is an old growth forest that has never been cut. It's totally different than it probably was 150, 200 years ago when it was burning frequently, because it's much denser, and some fire intolerant species have come in. But that's just something of interest to me, and I think is important for us to talk about, and also recognize that there may be more old growth out there than is often recognized. And so that's I think a positive that comes out of that realization as well.
Thanks, Will. I love that term, cryptic old growth. We'll be work that in here. Okay, and so
I
then
definitely stole it from somebody else.
Okay, I want to find out who. That's a good one. Maybe they're listening. Type in the chat if that's you. So Dr. Ryan DeSantis is an assistant professor of forest ecology and management at Oklahoma State University. And not to steal your thunder, Ryan, but I wanted to comment from your bio that you have a really diverse background, especially geographically. I'm sure experientially as well, but all the way from the East Coast to California to many sites in between, and then also the Lake States. So I'm really excited about that diverse perspective that you're going to bring here. And then I also want to mention what's the coolest thing here is that you live in what we often refer to here as the most underrated and unknown old growth ecosystem in the United States, and that's the cross timbers. And so I bet there's a lot of folks here who don't know much about the cross timbers, and I'm really excited about you bringing that perspective. So if you could, please introduce yourself and give an insight to that question.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I am in Oklahoma now. Obviously, I grew up in and spent the first half of my life in New Hampshire, looking at, compared to cross timbers forests, much larger trees, mostly eastern white pine, red pine. Spent several years in the upper Midwest, again, pine ecosystems. Around 2005, there was a really compelling advertisement for a PhD position at Oklahoma State University that was focused on fire and old growth oak communities in Oklahoma. And I could not turn down the opportunity to take the PhD position. Once I finished that position, went to several other stops along the way before finally coming back here in 2022 to essentially the same department that I was a grad student in. Along all the places that I've lived, I guess I've always had some appreciation for all the different forest ecosystems in really different ways. And we've already kind of talked a little bit about some differing descriptions or definitions of old growth. And I guess, maybe the first half of my life, probably I considered old growth to have some of those classic components, large trees, the complexity, the tree density part, a lot of down dead wood. But now being in the cross timbers, most of those things don't really work as the definition for old growth in the cross timber. So I guess for people that are on that aren't familiar with cross timbers forests, these are really dominated by two oak species, one of which post oak is the longer lived, some of them nearly 400 years old, and also some eastern red cedar upwards of 700 years old. The trees are really small. They're growing on really poor sites. Unlike old growth out west, where what's remaining is possibly because it's been protected. In the cross timbers, it was just inaccessible, or if it was accessible, it was just too much work for people to go in and extract whatever wood was left in scraggly small trees. So what we're left with now, we have a lot of housing development pressure in cross timbers areas. So Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Dallas, Fort Worth metros, there's really higher land value in developing these forests and moving it to something else. Or they're forests that are not managed because there's no economic incentive to manage them. So without that management, that also means there's been less prescribed fire. They've really shifted in terms of species composition and structure. So really in the past 100 to 150 years, these forests look quite different than they did over the past 500 to 1,000 years. I guess my biggest pet peeve really is that they're underappreciated. Again, we think of old growth. Maybe I shouldn't say we. A lot of people may think of old growth and think of large trees. They might think of trees like Doug fir or Sitka spruce or redwood. But I guess like you've already mentioned, the trees that are kind of the underappreciated trees. My concern often now around here is really we're bulldozing these things down. There's not considerably high species diversity. It's not like biologically we're getting rid of a lot of diversity, but they're really unique ecosystems. Increasingly, there's less and less contiguous acreage. I had the fun time of having Dave Staley on my PhD dissertation committee, and I think Dave is maybe the source of the quote that cross timbers are the largest contiguous piece of old growth forest in the eastern U.S. or something along those lines. And that's probably the trajectory right now is not probably that. It's that we're getting more and more patchy cross timbers distribution, and eventually maybe it's not that there's not a whole lot of old growth left. So there's certainly concern there. There's not a whole lot of appreciation for cross timbers as a forest type or an old growth type. And fire, as we'll discuss more, I guess, fire is really a complicated issue. In some cases, it's hard to reintroduce it. In other cases, it's nearly too dangerous to reintroduce it. And there's really often hardly any middle ground.
All right, great. Thanks, Ryan, and thanks everybody for playing along with that question and introducing yourselves. So I've got these questions categorized, and I'm just going to ask them of someone, and then I will ask that person to answer it if they want to, and then everybody else can just join in as they want, as if this is a conversation. So, Lauren, I have a question for you. Based a little bit on our conversation, in preparatory for this, I thought this question was a great one for you, and it's perhaps it's two-part. So, this is the exact question from someone in the audience. Is it even possible to develop an objective definition of old growth that will work everywhere? And then I preface this by a comment that you made during our discussion about, is it the site or is it the trees? And so I think those are connected. And if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear it.
Okay, so first question, an objective definition that could be applied anywhere. No. I think it's too challenging, and I'm probably more of like an inclusive old growth person than an exclusive old growth person. I think more about there's a question in the chat right now talking about invasive species encroachment. Is that still old growth? And I would say, it's still important to manage. So whether or not we consider it old growth or not, you might have old trees, but it's also changing forest conditions. And then we think about the role of humans in old growth systems, and that's, varied across the landscape and also just changes with time. So we can't we think about Native American influence in fire, and then we also have to think about ourselves in our influence on old growth systems, things like acid deposition and things that we can't control, but we're still influencing ecosystems, non-native earthworms. When we think below ground or invasive plants can change soil properties. And so I think more about it's important to think about these systems as important sites across the landscape that we can value for intrinsic and extrinsic benefit, but we don't need to label them in a way that complicates their meaning to us. And so I think management's going to have to be site specific, and we have so few examples across the landscape that we can't use those examples to apply them other places without thinking about the past land use history or the species composition and structure of that particular site. And so I think, just a broad definition doesn't really work. Trees are all different ages. They all reach maturity at different ages. We have bald cypress that can get to be really, really old, and oaks that are 400 to 500 years old. You could think about I did my dissertation work on Chinese tallow, and only where it lives about 100 years old. If it's an old growth Chinese tallow stand that's 100 years old, do we consider that old growth? So I think there's just a lot of challenges in trying to place a human construct on something that's very dynamic process. And so that's kind of where I'd leave it.
Short answer is no, she says. I would have to agree. That's cool. How about the rest of the panelists? What do you all think?
I'll jump in and kind of add to that. So I've been working actually with Lauren and a whole bunch of other people on a project doing a science synthesis, a book on old growth in the South. And so we've had a bunch of discussions about definitions and the developing the concept of old growth in southeastern ecosystems. And one of the things we kind of started with was we knew we wanted to widen the spectrum of ecosystems that would that you could categorize as old growth. And so we decided to include grasslands, glades, right? So non-treed ecosystems as well as tree-dominated ecosystems within our kind of description and categorization. And so that does become challenging, right? To how do you define an old growth grassland? You can look at particular species, conservative species that are represented. And so we decided not to kind of define a particular specific definition, as Lauren was suggesting. And we have actually, I mean, to be honest, we've really struggled with this section of the concept of old growth and trying to explain it, to explain it clearly, right? And some of the things that we got into, that we've talked about, are one, continuity. So, and continuity of attributes within a system. And so that could be species that have been in a location historically for a long time that are continuing to be represented. But we also included disturbance processes like fire or wind, or flooding that might be an important piece of that old growth system. And then also, soils, climate, and including people potentially as well into that mix of continuity. And then, one other thing, just we talked a lot about old growthiness. So, right, like not saying it's either, it's not a binary, either it's old growth or it is not old growth, but there's a spectrum, right? And so you may have some invasive species, right? You may have had some cutting or removal of species. The megafauna are gone, so everything has been sort of affected, but you can kind of look for along that spectrum and a range of characteristics to try and identify how well that ecosystem represents old growth within that particular context.
Right. I like that idea of this kind of spectrum of this. Ryan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say on that last point, we often, when we're in, I guess, quote unquote, old growth cross timbers forests, we're often surrounded by lots of trash from the late 1800s, and they're disturbed forests from some point in time. They haven't been developed. There's old trees, but again, back to that definition. I mean, it's I guess it's too broad to assume that there's going to be, for example, lots of dead wood. I mean, in cross timbers forests, if there was a lot of fire used, it was probably more like a savanna or woodland. So to begin with, tree density is already pretty low. There's not going to be a whole lot that's going to die and be down dead wood. So that alone, you can't really compare that with, Pacific Northwest old growth whatsoever. But the disturbance regime is certainly part of it. I mean, the productivity is also part of it. I guess I strongly agree. There's so many differences in ecosystems that there's not really any way to use the same terminology within these different systems for old growth.
All right. Thanks, y'all. I'm going to move on because if we're not careful, we'll get stuck right here for the whole session. And it would be a valuable conversation, but we do have some other points to discuss. Jimmy, this one's coming at you. I liked this question a lot. It was very direct. So, and I think this person has an agenda. So, please explain well. Old growth forests can be fire dependent and disturbance dependent systems. Why? So I'll ask you, I guess, you agree with that, and why or why not?
I mean, the classic example across the Southeast is longleaf. That's the one that gets tossed around the most frequently. Almost anybody who's exposed to longleaf, and I include shortleaf, longleaf, compositional mixes, all depending upon the variation and where you're located. They tend not to be high density. They tend to have higher fire frequency. There are species that directly influence a higher flammability that have developed and kind of occur in those systems. So yeah, you've got those examples. Then there's a spectrum of ones who folks still kind of debate whether or not fire is super required, but it might be in kind of a common or periodic influence in those systems. And some of those pockets occur towards our western Piedmont mountains. Your ecozones or eco transitional niches where you've got some fire shadows in certain seasons or conditions, but in other scenarios they would be perfectly protected. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, Joe, and it's really explicit to the location that you're discussing.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more with that. And I love your example of longleaf and shortleaf pine systems. How about other folks? What are your thoughts on this?
I have a thought. So, we think about some of our old growth oak ecosystems here in the Midwest, and anyone that's tried to do even aged management with oak ecosystems knows that you have to it's a long-term process of building that reproduction pool of oaks in the understory through fire and maintenance. And so to think that these systems would exist without fire as a process to build that regeneration pool, and just even trying to manage them more intensively than we do our old growth systems kind of neglects, a fundamental part of how these forests develop.
All right. Well, that causes me to go off track. That's great. I love these I love a conversation that does that. I didn't plan to jump to this section right away, but Lauren, with that comment, I'm going to move we'll come back to definitions as we need to. But I'm going to jump ahead to managing towards old growth characteristics. So if we have a forest today, or I won't even use that word, not forest, but let's say we have an ecosystem that we want to move towards, an ecosystem that has old growth characteristics. So here's this question directly, quote, what about second growth? What about it? I love that question just on that, but there's more. Can forest management actually grow forests that contain old growth characteristics? So I thought that kind of riffing on your last comment about needing deliberate activities to develop regeneration pools. So I guess I asked that question to you. Can we move second growth through forest management towards these old growthiness, as Will said? Can we move it towards that? Lauren.
All right, I got myself into this one, didn't I? Okay. So, I mean, again, it's going to depend on your ecosystem, your forest community, on how you would do this. And if you have examples of what old growth might look like for that system, and thinking about, do you want to proactively manage for snags? Do you have some sort of set target for snag density if that's a part of the system, or downwood density? Do you want to, do some sort of crop tree release around certain trees to promote their growth, to be large structured trees, adding certainly fire back to the system? And so really thinking about where you want to take that stand civiculturally, and not because of timber goals or objectives, but we manage, stand structures and composition through civicultural prescriptions. And so thinking about how you would do that in a particular stand. We have so many second growth forests in the eastern United States that we are positioned to do that. And it can also be a benefit to promoting resilience, or resistance in climate change scenarios. So I think there's a lot to be learned. I don't think we've done many of those treatments experimentally across the landscape, but I know that has been a consideration on how we could manage for more complex structures and compositions, in thinking about the future of our forests.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I find myself thinking a lot about this idea of that we can operate multitask in the same location. So we can advance natural community integrity and attributes at the same time as having active management, or even perhaps product development. So other panelists, you all have something to add here?
Yeah, I'll as a non-manager, I'll jump in here, and just start by saying that I don't have any expertise in how you would actually carry this out silviculturally, but I mean I think to me it makes perfect sense, right? That you can, a second growth stand is on its way to being old growth, or we might term it like near old growth. And I see like a lot of this driving around the Ouachitas in this area. There's a lot of shortleaf pine that, it's about 100 years since the big logging episodes. And, these forests, it's an opportunity to, and the National Forest is doing a lot of burning. And so areas that they've restored look pretty good. They're starting to get somewhat larger trees. And if we think about what we really want, if it's structure that's going to provide habitat for a range of species, understory species, and insect and animal species, that maybe that can be created, and it doesn't matter if that tree is 100 years old versus 200 and 250 years old. And so I think that there are a lot of opportunities. Also, just in terms of thinking about the Southeast, it's wet, it's warm, it's highly productive here, and so I think about that creating an opportunity where you can grow old growth relatively fast in the Southeast compared to dry stands, xeric stands in the Western U.S. or further north where things are not growing as quickly. We have the possibility and opportunity to create those or recreate old growth systems more quickly in these areas.
Thanks, Will. That's almost an oxymoron now in my head. I've got to wrap around of this creating old growth quickly. That's cool. That's an interesting kind of mental exercise to think about. Okay, anybody else have comments on that? All right. So Will, I'm gonna move back to a different topic that I was going to get to before this one, but so the historical fire ecology of old growth. This is exactly as it was asked, and I think it is tailors to your background in particular, but certainly others. What do we know about the historic fire interval in different eastern forest ecosystems? How did it change from way back pre-human settlement through indigenous land management and then through the colonist land management? And I think related question, and this is a separate question. So what do we know about the historic intervals across these different systems, Will? How did that change through these cultural periods? And within your work, do you run into evidence for fire in old growth forests that were likely ignited by humans?
Okay, yeah, that's all good questions, and I could so starting with what evidence do we have? So tree ring record is a big piece and is nice because we can look at annually accurate fire scars, right, and get frequency and even seasonality of fires going back several hundred years. And so just real broadly, in terms of where we have tree ring evidence, we have a good amount of evidence from the interior highlands, the Appalachian region, in longleaf pine forests to a certain degree on the coastal plain. There's not very much information at all from the Piedmont. And just because there was so much clearance in terms of agriculture, in addition to logging, that most of the tree ring records have been obliterated in that area. Then within that, pines record scars the best. So even like, let's say within the Appalachians, the fire scar record is mainly coming from yellow pine stands. And again, where they remain, where they haven't been cleared. So that's not the entire landscape. It's mostly on less productive, drier sites. And then you can interpret a little bit into adjacent oak stands, right, that are surrounded by pines or interspersed with pines. And so that record, there was a lot of fire historically in shortleaf pine stands, Table Mountain pine stands, and then adjacent oak stands in these different regions. Um, let's see. So, uh, and you can dig into that in different areas, and there's more stuff coming out of studies in specific locations, but generally, frequent fire historically in pine and oak systems. Going back and looking at like the different um, time periods. So the tree ring record, it depends, but in places we'll go back into the 1600s, maybe the late 1500s. Um, one problem is that the tree ring record always, the sample depth gets lower as you go further back. So you have fewer trees from the 1600s and the 1700s than you do from the 1800s and definitely the 1900s. And that can make some difficulty in terms of interpreting and getting consistent record of the frequency of fire going back through these earlier periods. So the pre-human record we don't cover with the tree ring record. And really, in my view, people have been here and influencing ecosystems, let's say in the southeast, where I work, since the last glacial. Right. So they're just like an embedded piece of what's happened in the evolution of these ecosystems, in my view, which maybe we'll get into more kind of discussion of that. And then sort of like pre-Euro-American settlement, Native American periods in the particularly in the 1700s, maybe 1600s a little bit. There's variability. There's a lot of evidence, particularly from Joe Marshall and Mike Stambon, Richard Guyette, of the influence of humans and population density, and that fire may have been a little bit less frequent prior to Euro-American settlement because there were fewer people and Native American regimes had been disrupted drastically due to disease and cultural change and migration. So fire may have been a little bit less frequent, but there was still a fair amount of fire out in the landscape in these pine and oak ecosystems. Euro-American settlement, a lot of fire, not really very much change in terms of the seasonality. And so Euro-Americans may have picked up a lot of their burning practices from what Native Americans were doing and what they saw in terms, overlapping over time. And so, but probably increases in the highest frequency of fire around right before the turn of the 20th century and into the start in the industrial period, as populations increased, and then, kind of the exclusion of fire in the 20th century. And then, so the last piece, thinking about, were they lit by people? Again, there's like, a fair amount coming into this, but in my view, the vast majority of fires, at least in all the areas that I've worked in, the Ouachitas, in the Ozarks, and then in the Southern Appalachians, there's a lot of evidence that most of the fires, or a good portion of them, were human ignitions. And I base that on, one, just if you look at the contemporary record of fire occurrence in these areas, there's just not enough lightning ignited fires occurring to have produced fire intervals as short as what we see in either the Euro-American period or prior to that in the Native American period. Now, fuels have changed, it may have been more open and more lightning ignitions occurring in the past, but just the amount of fire, it seems like people had to have a heavy hand in that. Then also, the majority of fires in the historical record, like we're talking about like 90% at most places, are dormant season fires. And lightning and fires can occur in any season, but they tend to occur like in the it depends on where you are, but like early growing season and then maybe late growing season. And so you would expect that and that's mainly because of the pattern of lightning flashes, right? It's often drier during the dormant season, and so you would expect to see more growing season fires in the record and not so much dormant season fire. I think if it was um, the majority lightning fire, and then the last piece is that in most of the studies you see very little um, uh, correlation between drought and fire occurrence in the historical record. So we can look at tree ring reconstructions of drought conditions, and then we can match up fire years and look at, okay, are fires occurring in drier than average years? And out west, you see like this, significant, really clear pattern of like drought in the year of fire and even like lagged wet years preceding it. Um, in the eastern US for the most part, you just don't. And I'm kind of excluding longleaf pine to a certain degree in a lot of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the upland south. Um, but you just don't see any clear response at all in terms of climate. And again, that's like tends to be an indicator of human influence on the fire regime historically, is like when it is decoupled from the climate. And if you think about it, people can light during, they can decide to burn. They may decide to not burn in the driest years because they don't want to burn the entire forest down. They may also burn during less extreme fire weather. You can in a wet year, you can pick, all you fire managers out there have a better sense of this, but you can pick a dry couple weeks, right? And do your burns then. And it doesn't have to, be an annual drought. And so all of that, like kind of put together, gives me the impression that it was largely, the fire regime was largely driven by human ignitions. Now, lightning ignitions did occur, and historically, pre-humans, they may have been an important part of the evolution of these fire-adapted systems that then were maybe expanded and cultivated by human ignitions later on. So I'll shut up now because it's quite a bit.
Will,
I can answer questions.
Will, I could listen to that all day. I love it. Thank you. Ryan, can you share some perspective about the cross timbers?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, in addition to tree scars, we also have, I'm sure a lot of other places too, in Tennessee for sure, with the Delcourts, but in Texas and Oklahoma, we have a lot of bog deposits. We know what species composition looked like going back thousands of years. We also know there's a bunch of charcoal in those deposits too. So fire was being used. Again, there's a lot of places, especially in cross timbers forests, where lightning ignition is really uncommon. I don't know that much about historical climate, I guess, but if we assume the same weather conditions and we go back thousands of years and we're looking in tree rings where we see a lot of dormant season fire in the tree scar records, it seems pretty likely that people were using fire going back at least 3,000 to 5,000 years. There's also a lot of pine, oak, and grass pollen in during that time too. So there's the right species that are fire dependent. There's a lot of evidence with charcoal. And tying it back maybe to the previous question and discussion, really we probably wouldn't have as much oak forests in the eastern US lacking human disturbance. So I guess in that way, to have old growth, to maintain old growth, certainly old growth oak forests, and definitely in the cross timbers region, you have to disturb it. Otherwise, it's going to trend towards something else, more music, higher species diversity, and less fire tolerant species. So the whole musification thing.
Cool. Yeah, I love all those different records and learning about those. I wish we had more time in life to learn deeply about each one of those. They're so cool. Jimmy, any longleaf kind of perspective on that? And no pressure because we got other things to talk about.
No, I mean, I was building on what Ryan said. I mean, there are studies in different places that are coming from those peat bog kind of depositions that one of the botanists here in North Carolina, Alan Weekly, it likes to point out that places we look at right now that have been for a fairly lengthy period of time longleaf, if you go back far enough, weren't longleaf, they were oak dominated based on those pollen records and that charcoal record. And so that kind of goes into where do we stop the definition of what we call old growth? Because if you want old growth, the site might have been oak originally, and now we're looking at a pine species that is several thousand years old. So, I mean, it's obviously banter in our philosophical discussions, but I thought about that in the context of our longleaf definitions. To Will's exact point, the Piedmont and the mountains definitively show differences to coastal pine ecosystems. And it's, regardless of what everybody looks at, it's almost always highly influenced by human interaction.
All right, thanks. So let's see, I'm going to pivot just a bit here. I'm going to incorporate something from the chat and tie it to a conversation I had with you, Lauren. So there was a question in the submitted that said, I'm curious about the role of grazing animals and wildlife, for example, in terms of reducing fuel loads, pre-colonization on fire patterns. And in the chat, someone mentioned talking about a broader perspective on disturbance and considering these megafauna and just how all these different animals that used to be here. So Lauren, in our conversation preparing for this, we talked about how there's this idea that you can't go back to a previous condition because the pieces don't exist any longer. And so I guess I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to that perspective on how we move forward with old growth perceptions when we acknowledge that those things just aren't there anymore.
I think a lot of these things actually challenge all of our management, regardless if it's old growth or not. You know, we don't have large mega herbivores. We had a study on the Mark Twain a couple years back, actually using goats to try to reduce mid-story woody densities for woodland restoration, because fire was just not a tool that was able to be used at frequent enough intervals to actually have an effect. And then, you know, like we have increasing, you know, disturbance events. We think about, you know, last year there was like 100 tornadoes in Missouri alone, and that was far beyond what had been seen previously. And so we have historically changed conditions, so we can't burn as frequently. We don't tend the land the same way that was done in the past prior to Euro-American colonization, so that we can't get that back. You know, people are very intentional with what they were doing and cultivating plants to survive and feed their families. We just don't use land the same way. You know, and then fire. Our landscape is highly patchy, and there's, you know, challenges in using fire, both from just like a safety standpoint, but smoke to neighboring communities and people's fear of fire. And so even though, you know, there's a lot of literature out there suggesting that fire is an important component of our systems, there's still the other cultural significance of fire and its impacts to communities. And then, yeah, we don't have, you know, large mega herbivores walking around anymore and dispersing plant seeds and, you know, rubbing their backs against the trees and, you know, whatever they're going to do to help facilitate that ecological community. So I think in terms of looking forward, and kind of what I mentioned earlier, it's thinking about how we can build sort of across the landscape resilient communities towards these sort of disturbance pressures, and thinking about that we're limited in the number of tools we can use, but maybe there are other tools we can use. But, forests are really important for carbon sequestration and other, just human health benefits. And so we just need to think about how we want to manage our landscapes, and try to, keep every cog in wheel, as a great mind once said. So I think we just have to be pretty intentional.
Yeah, I really like that comment about maybe things are unexpected solutions might exist considering how diverse it was in the past. Do we have any more panelist input on this before we move on? Okay. Well, I guess I'm going to incorporate something from the chat also, and we do still have a major topic to get to, so don't let me go down this rabbit hole too far, please. But this reminds me of a comment that I've heard Cecil Frost say recently about, is fire truly a disturbance? And so someone in the chat just mentioned about Ryan, that your comment about these systems need to be disturbed, in quotes, because it's and that that word kind of relays some meaning that it's something things aren't used to. So is disturbance is something maybe that's unusual, whereas we know from these records that fire for many thousands of years has been a regular component of these systems. So I guess I'm wondering, and this is a philosophical question, I'll put to you first, Ryan, because you were mentioned in the comment, but is fire truly a disturbance in these ecosystems? I know Cecil Frost, I've seen him give a few talks in the last couple of years where he says it's absurd and it's as right as rain. Do we consider rain a disturbance in a forest? Fire is equally required in some of these systems. So any thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I was starting to write a response in the comments, so you're saving me from trying to listen and write at the same time. I I get it, but I guess I disagree. I guess in that case, it's almost like disturbance is being used in a negative context, which I don't think there's not a negative or positive here. I mean, to me, the disturbance is really just changing something, whether it's light, it's growing conditions, it's space. Clearly, fire or drought or something else as a disturbance is changing the conditions for woody vegetation in a way that's affecting regeneration, it's affecting mortality, and again, there's no bad or good here. It's just what it is. I think disturbance is fire. The way that I think of it, at least, has to be considered a disturbance, even if we go back 5,000 years and people were using fire. Um, and I guess this is where I think we can't disconnect people from the conversation here. I think just because people were using fire 4,000 years ago in eastern oak forests, and we were, 4,000 years later, we have a lot of oak. We're getting a big decrease in oak over the past 100 years, not because of fire exclusion, but because people are using fire less. To me, that just means, well, these are a lot of forest ecosystems that are actually kind of man-made, human-made. And that's not a bad thing. There's no judgment there. Again, no bad or good. It's just that's historically where we're at right now. So then we need to go back to management questions or objectives. What does a landowner want? What does a national forest need? What do we need for future resilience? Those are the questions that are really more important, I think. We can talk all day about definitions for disturbance, but I think, if one of the goals, maybe always should be one of the goals, is resilience, then maybe people disturbing an ecosystem in some way, whether it's cutting, fire, herbicides, whatever it is, maybe that's what we should be focusing on. I don't think there's any negative. I also don't think if we go back 5,000 years, we can't exclude fire as a disturbance, calling it a disturbance. Clearly, it changes structure, it changes tree canopy position, it changes so many variables that I don't know if we exclude fire from the definition, then what else can we include?
Cool. I really wish we were all together now at a conference, eating dinner, talking about this. That's awesome. Any from the other panelists? Any input?
I'll just add, and I agree with Ryan and Lauren that that disturbance. I mean, it depends on how you're defining it, but in terms of the ecological concept of disturbance, that I think fire still has to be classified as that. And maybe you can think of like, is it a disruption? Is a better word, and it's more like the removal of fire is a disruption to that system. And I think it relates to back to the idea of continuity in looking at old growth systems. And so, what you're trying to maintain or conserve is continuity of these attributes. And so again, like they could be biotic, but also abiotic. And so the disturbance regime, frequent fire, could be an important aspect of continuity in that system, because it was a part of what led to the development, evolution, cultivation of the species and the genetic diversity in that particular location. And that's like the important piece is maintaining that continuity. And so if it's frequent fire, then it's I don't know, it's a disturbance, but it's not disrupting the system, not disrupting continuity.
Yeah, just real quick, and David Godwin added, when it comes to frequent fire systems, the lack of fire is often the biggest disturbance. Absolutely. A lack of management is often the biggest disturbance. Totally agree.
This question struck a chord. I'm super grateful for that. There's been some good comments in the chat, and really appreciate that. It's a good one. Okay, so I do want to move on a little bit towards one of the subjects that we haven't gotten to. There was a lot of interest in this, and so this is the idea of reintroducing fire use to long unburned systems that hold legacy biotic stuff that we care a lot about. And often we call that, those are old trees. So here's a question direct from the registration questions. And Jimmy, I'm going to point this towards you initially. How do you manage for fire effects on sites with existing and high priority biological legacies that can't or must not be damaged? So I guess I would ask Jimmy the question. I think maybe for me would be, can you describe some of your experiences in that circumstance, and what are some practical techniques that help?
Yeah. So those items that we're calling of value are objectively being lumped into that consideration. So where I'm going with that is some people may consider them high value, other people may not rank them quite as high. So it comes down to that kind of choice scenario. In a lot of our discussions, we kind of put all those on the table and see where the constraints or overlaps of allowable conditions to put fire back into a system, kind of on a gross scale, begin to play out in terms of seasonality or condition wise. What we frequently see in many of these systems, main driver in decision-making processes for long suppressed locations is the volume and amount of duff. Because the feeder roots for a lot of the trees, shrubs, essentially get into that duff layer, and if you burn it in a scenario where you consume too much duff, or you get a smoldering duff layer that occurs for multiple days or even weeks, you may all but eliminate all of the above ground material living species wise that you have. Duff is a challenge regardless. Morgan Varner and I used to talk about the fact that duff is the easiest way to describe duff. It's kind of like a kitchen sink sponge. When it's wet, it's nice and soft. It's damp. Once it dries out, it's super hydrophobic, and you kind of have to run water over it for a long period of time before that it will become soft again. That's basically what happens to duff as duff dries out. That hydrophobicity is hard to break down. So you can kill pines, you can kill oaks, you can kill shrubs, you can eliminate any kind of herbaceous seed bank that may still be residual in an area by playing the game wrong. In one of our big spots, 300-plus-year-old trees, we decided to take a long-term timeline approach. We're not rushing putting fire back in, but we had a duff issue. And on a positive note, one of the things that works on duff is not just fire, but more exposure to sunlight. It starts to accelerate the decomposition. And so we worked on those undesirable mid-story species, mesophytic mid-story species in this upland area to create more sunlight, which created more of the temperature extremes and more of the moisture extremes. And so the duff not only begins to compress and more in that scenario, but it decomposes faster. And just by doing those kind of manual entry operation pieces for the first, I think it was 2 to 4 years, and not putting fire on the site at all, we took what was a 5-inch duff layer down to about 3.5 before we ever lit the first match in the area. That exposure to sunlight also allows the plants that are in place to start going, hey, wait a minute, my feeder roots that are way up in this duff layer are starting to get some adverse conditions. They're used to growing in a kind of that moist, damp, shady environment that the mesophytic species have created. Now they're growing, they begin to take those cues and start to grow roots a little further down. It's not fast, it's never fast, but that's another reason why we were spacing this out over several years. Once we began reintroducing fire, we were doing it with a lot of on-the-ground assessment of how moist was that duff layer. We wanted to whittle the duff layer down, but we knew we could come at it from multiple directions, not just throw a match on the ground and let's see what happens. Does that help, Joe?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that was fascinating. I really like that. I did the non-fire approach initially in that long-term perspective. Let's see. And you got some good thumbs up there from a couple times, so that was good. Gosh, y'all, we're getting close, and I want one more question, and we only really have about 4 minutes here. So I was going to initially point this question to you, Jimmy, because I think your experience here, your experience professionally is one that points towards the public in a way that others here don't. And so somebody asked this question, and I think it's a great one. And again, we don't have much time, but how do we make sure we bring the public along on this fire management journey here in the East? And so I described, some of like the whiplash we've all experienced professionally with this idea of old growth and disturbance. Imagine what that's like for the public. And it must be much even more acute than for us who have backgrounds in this. So I'm just curious, Jimmy, about if you have learned some practices about bringing the public into this idea.
Yeah, so I mean, our natural resource staff frequently we're training the local park staffs in a lot of ways about the different management activities, but we also interact with the public directly. we also utilize our partners through the fire exchanges, the local extension offices, et cetera, to try and get some of the messaging out. And the messaging's getting there. The public is becoming a little, I won't say dramatically, but increasingly more exposed to the fact that fire is common in these systems from mountains to coast. I can remember back even as far back as being an undergrad, and everybody was like, fire in the mountains, fire's not normal in the mountains. And yet we all understand how fire dependent oak systems are. So it's becoming more common knowledge. One of the biggest challenges we frequently run into is all of our properties we manage are really close to urban interface. I mean, North Carolina is one of the higher WUI states in the country. And a lot of our state parks, the minute we advertise we're creating a new state park, everybody wants to buy everything around it because they want the state park to be in their backyard. Well, that presents those management problems like Lauren was getting at earlier, where we may not have a lot of wiggle room to be able to send smoke one way or the other because of how that population's developed around it. We also have historic parks that are right in the middle of major metropolitan areas now. So, but the public messaging, start early. Be willing to be honest with them. Be willing to tell them what you do and don't know and what you're going to try and what your objectives are. Be willing to take input. I mean, somebody may have a preference on the direction you go, but if you can explain to them that the system requires kind of this form of disturbance for it to be healthy and stay the type of system that they're currently enjoying, they buy into that more. I had an area that was predominantly oaks, and one of our now retired biologists walked in there with me and he said, look at everything on the ground. The babies don't look like their mamas. And what he was referring to was the overstory was wholly different than the regen and the midstory that was being developed. The system was going to shift 180 degrees away from that kind of oak overstory if we didn't change the direction that we needed to go.
Yeah, that picture tells a lot, doesn't it? That's a great explanation. All right, well, thanks everyone. We have just about come to that time, and so I guess I'd give the panelists just one quick moment if you had any final comments you'd like to say before we wrap this up. Well, I'll say thanks so much to you all. It was a really fun time, and I want us to do this for real in person, okay? So let's all go to the same conference sometime in the next year.
That was
But I
great.
do well.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for organizing and inviting me, and I'm glad to see that so many people are interested in this topic.
Yeah, I'd say the same. Thanks for having us, and certainly reach out to anyone if you have questions. I'm sure we'd like to hear from people.
Happy to talk about our experiences.
All right. Well, you all have been really generous with your time, so thank you. Lindsay, I think we'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Joe. I think we can tell how engaging this discussion was just by the amount of hand claps and hearts that are coming across the screen, which is awesome to see. What a great way to end this season. It was really awesome to be in your space and hear all of your knowledge and expertise. So thank you for the time and the effort to put into this discussion. And thank you to all the panelists for joining. Fueling collaboration wouldn't be what it is without all of you. So thank you for all your support. And resources that the panelists provided will be posted on the Fueling Collaboration website. So feel free to take a look at the website and all of those resources. And then before we close out, there will be a survey pop up on the screen. It is anonymous, and we really truly appreciate any feedback that we're able to get for the Fueling Collaboration panel discussion series. And I think that is everything, and we hope to see everybody next season.